All right, class number 8. We're getting over the hill. So I'm going to talk about some basic character design shape theory. This is like the most basic thing that you can think about with character design. And basically what that means is foundational shapes. Okay, so foundational shapes in character design, be it 2D or 3D, you always look at it from a 2D point of view. Because no matter what you're working on, you might work on something in 3D, but it is actually viewed in 3D, but it's actually viewed in 2D. If I were to show you a model right now, or you were to play a video game, it's on a two-dimensional screen. You're not actually seeing it in 3D. The objects might be rotated and manipulated and what have you inside, and they have the appearance of 3D, but they're not technically 3D. The only true form of 3D would be stop motion, but even that, you're still viewing it in 2D. So anyway, when we talk about shapes, we don't talk about forms. We don't talk about three-dimensional volumes. Instead, we're going to talk about flat 2D, just basic shapes, okay? So the first one to discuss, which is probably the most used one of any of them, is the circle. So the circle is basically cute and cuddly. It's the most non-threatening of all shapes. If I were to throw a ball to you, you would probably try to catch it. If I were to throw a dagger at you, which is not round, you probably would not try to catch it. Think about if you were to walk across, a beach or something, and like one of those rocky ones, right? If it's got all these jaggedy rocks, you're not going to want to walk on those in your bare feet. But if you see one that's just soft, eroded, weathered rocks, then you aren't going to feel threatened by those, okay? A turtle does not make you scared. Maybe an alligator snapping turtle, but those are a little more edgy. But typically, round objects are non-threatening. So that's what you're most often going to see, because for the most part, when people are making designs, especially with like animation and some video games to some extent, they're trying to get as wide audience as possible, and that often means like children, and children will be the least threatened by round things. Okay, so especially in like Saturday morning cartoons and things like that, you're going to notice that the characters are generally very round. Sometimes it's considered dopey, sometimes it's considered, like I said, friendly, funny, things like that. So here you see we have Piglet, right? And Piglet is probably the least threatening of all of the Winnie the Pooh characters. Now, when I say round, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it has to be a perfect circle, but you can see everything about him is pretty circular, right? Pretty round, pretty friendly. Mickey Mouse is a great example. Obviously, his ears are circles, his head's a circle, his belly's a circle, his feet are circles, and sometimes even his hands are circles. He's probably like one of the worst designs that you've ever seen. I know some of you guys are like, I love Mickey. Mickey sucks. But you got to remember, he's not just a character, he's also a brand. So if you do a circle, besides the non-threatening thing, it's the least, it's the least non-liked, not non-liked shape. Basically what I'm saying is that it's not very chic, it's not very edgy, it's not very interesting. So, it's more likely that people are not going to dislike it. They're not going to love the design, but they're not going to dislike the design. If you try to make a really crazy, cool, interesting character, it might be really novel and innovative, but there's going to be a whole selection of people that are not going to, they're not going to like it. It's going to not be part of their taste. But if you do something very generic like him, you're going to get a wider audience. And so he works very well for that. And even his personality is boring. If you look at his friends, right? Goofy, decently funny. Donald, very funny. Mickey Mouse, not funny. I mean, he's kind of just there. He's kind of the straight guy. Okay. The next one would be squares. So squares generally represent stability. They're unmoving. They're resistant shapes. Think of things that are squarish, right? So a building, right? It feels stable. Think of a tree trunk. I know it's a cylinder, but when you look at it from the side, it looks like a rectilinear shape. Think of, what else is there? I'm trying to look outside. I don't know. Think of anything that's got a squareness to it, and you will see that it's got stability. A really great example of this would be when you see a landscape, right? It's generally, if it's a flat landscape, it will be a perfect horizontal. And like I said, if you see trees or buildings, those will be perfect verticals. And so there's a sense of like stability there, a sense of strength by having these 90-degree angles. So oftentimes what you're going to notice is that the solid character, the dependable character, very often hero characters, the strong arms will be rectilinear. And if you look at here, you can see he's kind of squarish, right? He's got a square overall feel. Now you're still going to notice that regardless, all these characters are generally going to have rounded features. Again, it just makes it more friendly. If he was a perfect square, like very pointed, he wouldn't be as appealing generally. So anyways, you can look, he's very square because he's basically that big, strong, tough guy, right? And if you think of Mike Wazowski, he's a circle, right? So he's the dopey, silly, dumb character. Well, he's kind of the wise guy too, which goes against a little bit, but he's the one that everyone kind of laughs at. He's a pushover. This guy, on the other hand, everyone thinks is more threatening. He's stronger. He's bigger. Now, this is a great example. So if you look at, was it Carl? I can't remember his name, but the guy from Up, you'll notice that he has nothing but squares. Square head, square body. You can see even his pants, they kind of give it a squareness to it. Even his shoes, he's got a square walker. His chair is a square. His glasses are square. You'll notice that his wife, before she died, had a round chair, and she was a round character. And he has round balloons sort of represent her. That movie's very, very full of shapes. But basically, his whole plot line, even his ears got a squareness to him. His whole plot line is that he doesn't want to move on from his wife, right? He doesn't want to lose his house. He doesn't want to move on with his life because he misses his wife and he loved her and he had all these things. And so basically the whole story is about him trying not to change. But then in his life comes a circle character, the Boy Scout, can't remember his name. He comes in and, you know, he's dopey and silly and what have you. And he helps him basically change because the whole time he's carrying that house, right? And as he's going, it's losing balloons and it's getting heavier and heavier. And he eventually has to make a decision to leave the house to take care of the kid. And that's how he gets past it. But the whole point of his character is an unmoving character. Next we have triangles. So triangles, there are only three primary shapes here. Triangles basically are the most directional. They're aggressive. They're very often the catalyst of the story. Typically you're going to see that the villains or sly characters are triangles. Okay, so generally speaking, the bad guys, the antagonist, not the protagonist, they are going to be your triangles. So if you look at here, good old 90s Batman, everything about this guy is triangle. He's got like kind of a triangular nose. His head shape's a triangle. His hair is a triangle. You'll even notice with his coat, they made it triangular. His shoes are very triangular. He's actually not as triangular as some other ones, but he's very edgy. And there's a lot of, his eyes are triangles. A lot of triangles. So you get a sense that he's a very sly, very villainous, very quick kind of character. Very obvious that he's just not a good guy. If you look at here, right, so we got Angelina Jolie, and you'll notice that what they do with her cheekbones, they kind of pointed them out, right? And she's got these, like, you know, pointed things and the horns and stuff. This comes down to a triangle. So even with, like, live action movies, they'll still incorporate that, right? She got this widow peak thing. Very triangular, right? And so because she's meant to be a villain character. I forget what her name is, but... and then over here we have Gil. And you may be like, Gil's not a bad guy. But if you remember, when they started with it, they were like, you thought he was. Like, everyone was scared of him, and he was like in a shadow, and, you know, he's the tough guy with a heart of gold. You know, you just got to get in the inside. And so they play off the fact that you think that he's going to be evil or villainous or bad, but he actually ends up being a really nice guy. But his exterior gives off a different impression. And that's something else that you can do. You don't have to do literally, your villain characters must be this, and heroes must be squares, and what have you. It's actually a better idea not to do that. But if you do need to, you know, if you have a limited amount of time and you don't have a lot of time to develop characters, it's a very quick way of basically presenting a character and for the audience to instantly know what they are. But it is probably a little less interesting. And you can go down the line with a bunch of movies and you'll know this. Okay, so if we look at like a cast of shapes here, so here we have like Aladdin, right? So if you look at the carpet, he's generally kind of squarish, right? Because he's kind of reliable. He catches him literally, and he's a solid character. If you look at the genie, right, he's a round character. He's kind of silly. He's kind of dopey. Notice that he's kind of up, right? So he's a very buoyant shape. He's very, like, in the air, and he's happy, and he's what have you. If you look at Jafar, right, very much triangles. He's the villainous character. If you look at the Sultan, right, he's all rounds. He's a dopey, silly, dumb man. And then over here, you notice that she's a little bit triangular, and he's a little bit more square, which is typically what you're going to see with males and females, and that's because women are evil. No, I think it just shows more femininity. But you will also notice that of all these shapes, it's the least extreme, these two. And there's a reason for that. Generally speaking, you're going to notice that the main character of most animated films are going to be the least interesting, both in personality and also, and we'll talk about personality later, both in personality and also in shape. There's a bunch of different theories out there why that might be. Here's some. One is, generally speaking, that character needs to do more, meaning that they physically are going to have to run around and be able to gesture better than the other characters. If you think about him, he's jumping over roofs and he's doing all sorts of physical actions. They also need to be able to act better. Great example of this is that if you watch any superhero movie, right, and they get to the last scene and they're trying to talk to either the villain who's actually their friend or a woman or whatever, they take their mask off and then they plead their hearts out, right? And you're like, why the hell are you taking your mask off? Now everyone knows who you are. But the reason why is because they can't act with the mask. They can't perform the function, that emotional tug that they need to with the mask on. And there's a bunch. You can look at Spider-Man does it with Dr. Octopus. Batman does it with Selena Kyle. You can look at, there's a bunch of movies where they basically take off the mask because the actual character design cannot do what it needs to do in that moment, so they have to make adjustments. So that's one reason. Another reason is that these are the characters that we relate to. They're also the main characters, so that means that basically these are the ones you're going to be looking at the most. You can't take as many artistic chances with them, because if they don't like the character design of the main characters, they're going to see them the entire time. They ain't going to like the movie. So that doesn't work very well. They're also, like I said, the characters that we relate to, which means that they need to be, I don't know if I want to say more humanoid, but they need to be more approachable. And some of these other shapes, more extreme shapes, make it more difficult because you won't see yourself in them as much. Another theory, which this is probably honestly the largest one, is that these are big productions. And so what that means is that these designs get passed through probably a lot quicker, the side characters. Someone comes up with a design, they're like, yeah, that's great, blah, blah, blah. These ones may take longer, and they're going to go through more people. And so it's kind of like, let's say you make a sculpture, and it looks really cool, and it's really edgy, and it's neat, right? Well, if you hand that to the person above you, she might be like, oh, I don't like this, and will rub off a cool, what you thought was an interesting part, but doesn't really suit her. Then she's going to send it up to the person above her, and he's going to be like, I don't like this. And then he rubs off another part, and then he gives it to the woman above him, so on and so forth, until we end up with is a round rock. And it's not very interesting, but it doesn't offend anyone, and it's just kind of what happens. Also, and we'll talk about this later on with the Bland Boy, what ends up happening is that if you make, they're spending millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars on these films, they don't want to take a chance with an edgy design, and on the off chance that people won't like it. If they've done a design and they know people like that design, they're just going to keep trying to sell it. Look at Call of Duty. Right? They're not going to change it up a bunch because it'll turn people off. They'd rather just stick to what they know works, and then, they'll just go off of that. Anyway, so there's a bunch of designs. Went off on a tangent. Hercules is another one. I typically use Disney here just because they're a little more obvious. But again, if you look, villain character, right? Triangles. This dude's just loaded with triangles. If you look at him, right? Square, very, very rectilinear, right? Square jaw. It's got a very square bucket head. Clearly a hero type. Clearly looks strong. And if you look at the satyr here, Phil, very round, right? Very round, dopey looking. Kind of looks like one of the dwarves from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But that's obviously sort of a juxtaposition of his personality. He's actually a very rough, gruff, mean, angry man. But he looks cuddly, and they even make jokes off of that where people will try to hug him and stuff. So it creates a more, I mean, out of the three of these characters, he's probably the most interesting, at least written down wise. James Woods pretty good as Hades, but he's an interesting character in that his dynamic's a little bit different. Now, this whole time I've concentrated on shapes, but it's not actually shapes, it's about angles. So the more obtuse the angle is, the more round and soft and blunt, it's non-threatening. The more acute, the sharper, the more scary. So a good example is I took my son to the aquarium, and we saw the dolphins, like, ooh, dolphins, 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 ooh, you know, yay, dolphins, right? Then we went down, and we went to the shark part, which is super cool, and actually is his favorite now. But when at the time, he had his hands over his eyes. If you think about it, they're generally kind of the same shape, right? It's this sort of porpoise with a fin on top and fins on the side, right? And a mouth and eyes. They're very similar. But the difference is that he's a lot more triangular and a lot more more acute, right? His parts are sharper. If you look at like a cheetah, right? It's got these sharp edges and, or something like a tiger or something. It's got claws, it's got teeth. And so they just seem more threatening. Another great example is if you've ever seen Coraline's, excellent movie by Leica. You'll notice that the other mother starts off with this design when she's trying to like Coraline or get Coraline to like her to become her other mother. She's a little more rounded. There's a little bit of edginess to her, which does create like a little, little bit of a sifty thing there, but generally round. Then, as time progresses, she turns into this thing. You see, she gets pretty sharp here. This points up, and this, all these, just gets very angular. And then at the very end, when she turns into the spider lady here, you can see, look at her breasts are like just this weird trapezoid shape. These things come off all pointed. She's got these claws now, right, that pointed on her head, and you can't see it very well, but there's all these cracks that are creating these triangle shapes. Very, very strong angles. So it's really about angles. So complementary and whole shapes. So the idea with complementary shapes are just shapes that are basically shapes that work together, and repeating shapes are just reusing the same shape multiple times in order to show the design. And whole shapes just means like the character in general should feel as one whole shape. So if you look, I'm just using comics here because comics are fun. If you look at Wolverine, right, he's got this kind of repeating triangle shape here that like his little ear fins have them, his little side does, he's got some here, his shoes, right, are the same. And what that does by repeating those elements is it makes the entire thing a lot more cohesive, because you see it repeated over and over again. You can tell that this boot belongs to this character because it's the same general shape. It has similar properties, right? They use blue consistently, yellow. All those things kind of help make it, those repeating shapes help make it more cohesive, okay? And there's some complementary as well. You can see, this is sort of similar to that, but it's not exactly the same. Things like that. Now, this is a better example of whole shape as well as repeating shape. So I'm just using Batman because I think he's like an excellent example. And you can see this also in the live action film. So first thing I want to point out is this. If you look at the typical 90s Batman, you see it has the little bat symbol here, right? And it's sort of in the middle. It's not anything, jumping one way or another. Did I write stuff? Oh, I did. Okay. Sort of in the middle. If you look at his forms, they're kind of in the middle too. He's not overly big. He's not overly small, right? He's got a little bit of edginess to him. He's got a little bit of squareness to him. Kind of a typical hero, right? Classic Batman. Now, if you look at the two over here, we've got, what's this Batman called? Batman Beyond. If you look at here, right, and this cartoon obviously came after this one because they're still trying to make a buck. His symbol is much more triangular and much more light. Notice how the wings are up, right? And so it creates this more like uplifting, more quicker looking kind of symbol. His points are a lot sharper. He has them too, but they're the same triangles. He generally has a very like equilateral triangle for his triangles. You're going to notice they're all kind of even, and these will have the same thing. But these are much more sharp. His legs are sharper. He's thinner. You can see these are much longer, right? So it's got this kind of quick, younger, faster feel, right? But you can see that's consistently throughout the entire character, and the entire character works in that way, in the same way. Now, if we look at this old school Dark Knight one, and I don't know if you ever watched Dark Knight the animated DC ones. They're phenomenal. You should really watch them. This dude is like mad square. So let's look at the symbol, right? It's this big kind of almost square shape. And the last Batman movies are like this too, the Batfleck or whatever, the ones that Ben Affleck played. Anyway, much more square. And you're going to see that's consistent throughout the rest of the character. His shoes, right, which they did a bad job drawing, are very square. His shoulders are square. You can see his head is much more square. His ears are not nearly as pronounced. Even his little spiky things here, I'm sure some of you guys know what those are called and think I'm an idiot, but even those are squarish. His arms, everything about him is much more square, which gives this very like juggernaut, strong, unmoving, much more tough, but slow, right? You definitely can tell that he's slow. If these two guys fought, this guy would be jumping all around him. But if he got a hold of him, he would crush him, right? That's generally the kind of feel. But by changing the shapes around, you kind of change, the dynamic away from just this traditional, which is more middle of the road, okay? So inside of your character designs, besides the general shape, obviously I was just talking about angles, right? So besides the angles on the ends of shape are the lines that connect your angles, okay? And so basically you can do 3 types of lines. You can do a straight or a curve. Didn't draw a straight, but you can do a straight, you can do a curve. You can do an S curve, and then you can do like a straight against a curve, which is generally what we consider, pretty good looking. Out of these 3 shapes, this one's the most interesting. And to kind of prove my point, I just grabbed this Looney Tunes picture and I drew over top of it. And you'll notice that everything is a C or an S or some sort of curve like that. So look at, here's an S, right? Here's an S, here's an S, here's an S, here's a C, here's a C, here's an S, then here's a C, then a C, then an S, then a C, 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 C. Do you see? But you can tell all these shapes are basically built off of only these. What I'm getting at is that you will not draw M shapes. Like, you won't have a curve that goes up and down and up and down. It loses strength and vitality, and it doesn't look as good. It's more confusing. So, for instance, a good example is you kind of get one sort of here. Now, when you look at this, I drew it as 2 separate lines, and that's how I would. But you can see if he had a stronger, like he has here, notice this side of the face looks nicer than this, because this is a little looser, so it almost looks like an M, and it's not as it doesn't work quite as well. All right, you can even tell up here they do it. Kind of a C, kind of a C. Doesn't really have much S's going on in here. C. Well, these aren't really a great example. But you can look at most cartoon stuff. So you can even look at anime stuff, and they still follow the same general rule. You do not want to overcomplicate that basic form. Now, obviously, if you're doing a realistic character, it's not going to do this exactly, all right? But it's a good idea that when you draw the foundation or when you're sculpting the foundation forms of the character, even if you're going to have more incongruent, like, surface texture, I would still start with this sort of idea because the design will be much stronger, much more direct, and much more to the point. It's like having a more well-written essay. Each line of your character, of whatever you're drawing, is basically one sentence, and all the lines together create basically a paragraph that describes the character. And so the more unnecessary lines, or the more not as well written lines, the more muddy the character will be, and the less punch the character will have. It won't work as well. So you want to try and keep that as much as possible. I'm just going to quickly cover this because I think this is the last thing. Yeah, I'm just going to show you real quick. Actually, I won't do that. So anyway, that's some character design stuff. We're going to talk about it again in the next class. I'm going to talk about a little bit more complicated stuff, if you will. I did air quotes. But for now, that should probably be enough to wet your whistle.